2011, the Marvel Cinematic Universe had 2 official movies. To expand, Marvel planned to release 2 in the same year, Captain America in July, and in April, the self-titled Thor. Thor was considered an odd choice to adapt. As a character, he was considered pretty basic next to the complicated mess that was Iron Man. Captain America, on the other hand, was famous. 10 years on, the expectations around Marvel movies have changed, and so have the people who watch them. Thor was well received at the time, but now seems to be considered one of the worst in the cinematic universe. There's a lot to like in Thor: fun dialogue, great sets, detailed costumes, and fantastic acting.
Another!
But maybe you're one of the Marvel fans that looks back on Thor and thinks it's the worst Thor movie. You're wrong, that's Ragnarok. Though people don't tend to look back on it fondly, Captain America and Thor debuted in an attempt to solidify Marvel's domination. So when I say Thor made $78 million more than Captain America: The First Avenger, it's gotta mean something. In an interview with Collider, director Kenneth Branagh said this: "There was no question that tonally Thor was critical after the massive success of the brilliant Iron Man from Mr. Favreau and Robert, and then slightly less successful in their terms, The Incredible Hulk. Thor became critical to being the sort of tonal bridge, featuring literally a rainbow bridge as well, between, as it were, the Earthbound and Spacebound and Fantasy-bound parts of the Marvel Universe. So there's a kind of connective matrix that Thor, Asgard, the Nine Realms, and everything that it involved could provide inside that large Marvel Cinematic Universe that was enormously important, that couldn't be done by the brilliant Captain America, because it wasn't the same material. This was the one that said, 'Is there a fantastical future?'
Part one, this is the bit where we recap the movie, in case you haven't seen it in a while.
So first we get this quick flash of Jane searching, essentially, for a wormhole. Jane and her crew get caught up and hit Thor with their truck. We jump from here straight into a legend about the frost giants, narrated by Sir Anthony, and bam, we're in Asgard. Put a pin in it, we'll come back to this. Then Odin delivers our moral argument about being a leader and a man at the 6-minute mark.
A wise king never seeks out war.
Note, I like how earnestly this movie deals with royalty and leadership. Of course, we live in a world where we straight up don't have a need for royalty, and the idea of giving people leadership based on bloodline is preposterous, but this is a fantasy. The whimsical nature of Asgard allows us to abstract the meaning of royalty here, and have becoming king be a simple stand-in for being a responsible adult man. And then, Thor 3 was like, hold on, let me take this extremely literally. Thor enters the throne room, about to be crowned king.
As a weapon to destroy, or as a tool to build?
Thor never uses Mjolnir to build. Before he can be crowned, frost giants interrupt the coronation.
Frost giants.
Once the frost giants have been dealt with, Thor gets upset and insists on going to Jotunheim to beat up all the frost giants. Note, the frost giants of Jotunheim go to Asgard to get the casket of Ancient Winters, which is essentially a terraforming device, and as far as I know, rightfully theirs. Odin tells Thor he can't go and beat up the frost giants because it would start a war. Later, Thor gets mad, again, and Loki uses some not at all subtle reverse psychology to trick Thor into defying Odin.
Exactly. There's nothing you can do without defying Father. No, I know.
Anyway, we meet Heimdall, who's in charge of the way out of Asgard. Whatever voice filter they've got in Idris here is awesome. I love it. It's subtle and it's really cool. Thor, Loki, Lady Sif, and the Warriors 3 go to Jotunheim. Things don't go well for them, and Odin has to rescue them. Having just potentially started a war, Odin yells at his son, but when Thor shows no remorse, Odin punishes him by sending him to Earth. However, he also sends Mjolnir, making Thor's return to Asgard conditional on him growing up. And we're back at the beginning. More Dutch angles. Put a pin in it. We'll get to that. Thor gets tasered and taken to the hospital. He wakes up and we do a real classic Hercules in New York, Prince Edward in New York thing.
Peasants, I set you all free.
We get a glimpse of some randos trying their hand at lifting Mjolnir, like Caliburn from the Stone. I like the spot. It's a nice, simple scene that sets Mjolnir up. Jane adopts Thor because, he's weird. Cut back to Lady Sif and the Warriors 3, and we see that they really want to do something to bring Thor back, but they don't. They just kind of talk about how they want to do something to bring Thor back. Loki goes to pick up the casket of Ancient Winters, and we officially reveal that he is a frost giant. Hiddleston and Sir Anthony have an acting off. Anthony wins, which I like to think Hiddleston would agree with. Jokes aside, this is genuinely a great scene. It's an affecting scene of a father-son relationship that feels very real to me.
I'm the monster parents tell their children about at night.
He just called his own species monsters. We really never going to follow up on this? It's literally heartbreaking. Put a pin in it, we'll come back to this. As a result of their argument, Sir Anthony ends up in the Odin sleep. Odin ends up in the Odin sleep. Back on Earth, Thor smashes a cup in a now iconic scene, then walks down the middle of the road. Jane then has her equipment stolen by S.H.I.E.L.D. Loki reveals to Lady Sif and the Warriors 3 he's now the acting king, then Thor says this.
I need a horse.
Jane decides to help Thor on his quest to get Mjolnir back, because now that S.H.I.E.L.D. stole all of her equipment, she has nothing better to do anyway. Jane and Thor get to the landing site, where Thor fails to lift Mjolnir, meaning he's not currently worthy of wielding it. This happens halfway through the movie, put a pin in it. Thor is captured by S.H.I.E.L.D., and Loki shows up to tell Thor that Odin is dead, which is a lie. He then tells Thor that there's a truce between Jotunheim conditional on his exile, which is a lie, and finally says that Frigga has forbidden Thor's return, which is also a lie, then leaves, but not before doing this. Embarrassing for you. I'm embarrassed for you. I'm personally embarrassed for you. Thor gets rescued from S.H.I.E.L.D. and gets drunk with his new friend. Cut to Loki, who makes a deal with Laufey, king of the Frost Giants, also Loki's secret dad, and we reveal that Loki is the one who let them into Asgard at the beginning of the movie. Big surprise! Loki employs the Frost Giants to kill Odin for him so he could be made king permanently. In exchange, he'll give Laufey the casket of eternal winter so that he can restore Jotunheim to its former glory. Back on Earth, Thor and Jane have a nice scene where we show that at the very least Thor paid attention in history class, and Jane finds it wildly endearing. Put a pin in it, I'm going to talk about this. Lady Sif and the Warriors 3 decide to go to Earth to bring Thor back. Note, where is my Lady Sif and the Warriors 3 TV show, Disney? Loki discovers what Lady Sif and the Warriors 3 have done and sends the Destroyer down to Earth to kill Thor. Lady Sif and the Warriors 3 find Thor and all attempt to stop the Destroyer, but it's harder than it looks. Also, can I just ask, why is Hogun holding his Morning Star the wrong way round? However, when the powerless Thor is willing to sacrifice himself to save a bunch of mortals, Mjolnir finds him, deciding he's finally worthy. His powers are restored, and Thor slam dunks the Destroyer and rushes back to Asgard to stop Loki. Freeze. Enhance. It's sad that they never follow up on this, honestly, because I feel like this would have been a really funny subplot for the movies to have. Laufey goes to kill Odin, Loki stops him and kills his biological father, proclaiming himself the son of Odin, but then later tells Thor that they're not brothers. So which is it, Loki? Thor rushes in, gets mad at Loki for trying to kill him, which is fair, and Loki blasts him and declares he has to go destroy Jotunheim, presumably out of a sense of self-hatred that no other Marvel property will ever bring up again. Put a pin in it. Thor goes to stop Loki, they fight. This happens.
Brother, please.
The only way Thor can stop the destruction of Jotunheim is by destroying the Bifrost, but that means leaving Earth and Jane behind. He decides that's the most morally sound thing to do and destroys the bridge, saving Jotunheim. Both Thor and Loki fall to their deaths, but Odin rescues them just in time. However, as a final screw you, Loki lets go and plummets to somewhere. Sometime later, we see Jane back on Earth disappointed, and Thor back in Asgard disappointed. Sir Anthony delivers our moral argument once more about the nature of wisdom, and Thor goes to the edge of the bridge to check on Jane, and Heimdall tells him Jane's fine. Fade to black. Where am I? Ah! Okay. Now we get to talk about the good shit.
Production design.
Production design. I made this. If you watch this movie with me, I will start screaming and having a great time the moment I see Asgard. It's next to Zora's Domain as one of my favorite fictional places. It looks so good, and you will never get to see it like this ever again in the Marvel Cinematic Universe or in any of the Thor movies. And it frustrates me. Bo Welsh, the production designer, and Alexandra Byrne, the costume designer, said that they evolved the term ancient modernism as the best way to describe the feel of Asgard. It's kind of a silly term, but I really like the way it describes the aesthetic. To inspire them, they looked at issues of Journey into Mystery, the first comic Thor appeared in. Asgard in the movie, it looks like it's specifically based on the way Jack Kirby drew it. I actually bought issue 85 of Journey into Mystery, which is the first appearance of Asgard. This is what I got from issue 85. I'm not sure what I was expecting exactly. However, I will include some other pictures I found around the web of classic Asgard They've really kept the jagged futuristic nature of it, which is not only cool as heck, but really different and shows a lot of respect for the source material. Asgard really captured my imagination as a kid, so I was pretty taken aback when I saw Dark World, and the sets had changed completely. It's always been kind of baffling to me why the aesthetic changed so much from the first movie to the second. So to figure out why Asgard is so different, I bought the art book for Thor 2 and Thor 1. Kevin Feige, president of Marvel Studios, said this about it. It's not all polished and golden in this film. We see a street-level view, the nooks and crannies of how people actually live there. Real people, not just golden super beings. Production designer for Thor the Dark World, Charles Wood, said this. Rather than everything being futuristic, we wanted to ground it in the past. But we tried not to make it purely historic either. We were aware when designing these sets that they would come in and add in technologies in post that we were unfamiliar with into this more familiar environment. Later in the same book, he also says this. Asgard had been established in the first film, and what we wanted to do now was try and give it a sense of history. Since we had already shown the palace, the throne room, and so much of the royal aspect of Asgard, we thought this was our chance to meet the more common folk. Even if Asgard had always looked the way it does in Dark World, as an aesthetic, it doesn't sit right with me for Thor as a character. It's too dark, too sad, too Game of Thrones for a superhero who says stuff like this.
I need a horse!
Not only does the contrast from 1 to 2 give me whiplash, but it also reads as pretty rude to the production designer on 2 to take the work of the previous production designer and just erase it, saying all he did was add more history and warmth, when in reality he did so much more than that. Which brings me to Jotunheim. Jotunheim, after many viewings, to me was just an icy wasteland. Let's be honest here, these scenes are a bit dark, because, as I discovered when I read it in the art book, Jotunheim is a city, like Asgard, but it's run down because they don't have the casket of ancient winters. It's an incredibly cool idea for a realm. It shows the impact of what Odin did, why the frost giants want the casket back, and why they're angry. But it also shows us frost giants are intelligent, thoughtful, that they weren't always the monsters that Asgardians think of them as. Of course, it's possible the remnants of the city are just a reflection of a realm that the frost giants terraformed, but I like to think it's an example of how intelligent civilization has fallen. Plus, it could be an additional incentive for Loki to look further into his ancestry and determine that the label of monster is or isn't right. And of course, we go from the magical space of ancient modernism to a desert. Originally, I thought the desert was used because they tend to represent death. It would make sense as a visual setting to reflect what's happened to Thor, but production designer Bo Welsh said this. What we decided early on was that Asgard and the Nine Realms are up there. They're causing disturbances in the sky, so we wanted an earthbound location that gave you an opportunity to see a massive sky. Why the production designer is deciding where the story takes place instead of the writer, I don't know. Maybe he didn't. But just in case, the location of your story is something the writer should decide. Which brings me to writing arena. I was trying to figure out how to articulate the problem with the switch back and forth between Asgard and Earth. Then I realized this is an essay. I can't just reference stuff, and then it hits me. Boom, storytelling. What are you kidding me? We gotta go to meet Mr. Storytelling himself, I say. So you go, why not? I go, why not? Pretty soon the whole group goes, why not? So here we are, humble audience. I'd like you to meet the favorite son of storytelling, John Truby. In John Truby's The Anatomy of Story, Mr. Truby details a concept in storytelling called the arena. This is my ballpark now, idiots! I'm so happy to be referencing this. A story arena isn't exactly a place where the story happens. It's a concept that intends to lend your story cohesion in its location. Mr. Truby goes into more detail and tells us about 4 ways to create a sense of arena in our story. Number 1, create a large umbrella and then cross-cut and condense. In this approach, you describe the larger scope of the story somewhere near the beginning. In effect, you start with the big world and the wall that divides it from everything else. Then focus on the smaller worlds within the arena as the story progresses. The most notable example of this technique would be Star Wars. Star Wars tells you the story takes place in space, then takes you to various different locations that all fit within the movie's idiom and visual language. Thor doesn't really apply here because there's no scene setting for space as an arena. and we never focus on smaller areas within our arena. We just cut back and forth between two places, which can be pretty jarring while watching any movie, but Thor 1 attempts to make it less jarring by creating a through line between Earth and Asgard, with a few of the buildings mimicking the shape of Asgard, and both color palettes being gold. Our second arena is when we send the hero on a journey through generally the same area, but one that develops along a single line. Mr. Truby goes on to further explain this technique, saying, "You can create the sense of a single arena if the arena the character travels through remains fundamentally the same, like a desert, an ocean, a river, or a jungle." Arena 3. Send the hero on a circular journey through generally the same area. This is essentially like the second example, but our protagonist gets to go home at the end. Mr. Truby cites The Wizard of Oz, Finding Nemo, and King Kong as good examples. I've never seen King Kong. Does he get to go home at the end? Is Monkey okay? Does Monkey survive? 4. Make the hero a fish out of water. I think this is most likely what they were going for with the movie. When talking about this kind of arena, Mr. Truby says this: "Start the hero in one arena, spend enough time there to show whatever talents he has that are unique to that world, then jump the character to a second world without traveling, and show how the talents the hero used in the first world, while seeming to be out of place, work equally well in the second." As much as it saddens me to say this, if we wanted the movie to be more cohesive, we should have spent less time in Asgard. The Warriors 3 should have come with Thor, so we could make even more jokes about how out of place they are, and Loki should have been on Earth trying to kill him. While there's an obvious effort made to make the desert and Asgard look similar, and I do think to a certain extent that worked, I do still think it's pretty jarring for two major storylines to be happening in two completely different places. This isn't a failing on the visuals. The visuals in Thor are fantastic all the way throughout. But from a writing perspective, these should have happened in the same place. But that does mean you have to cut Asgard, so honestly, I understand why they didn't, and they stuck with two locations. Side note about Arena. Mr. Truby says that deserts and ice represent places of dying and death. That's why Luke beginning his journey on Tatooine feels so appropriate, and why Rey settling there at the end is whack. A desert as a place for Thor to end up after being kicked out of paradise, visually and thematically, it makes perfect sense. I kind of wish we'd made the town look more dead, just to drive that point home, to make it more a visual reflection of where Thor is emotionally. Which brings us to, what's Thor's journey in this movie?
Part 4 of the video. This is part 4. We're doing part 4 now. It's Thor. The part about Thor.
This movie's pacing is pretty strange at times, and Thor's journey can seem pretty binary. To understand why, let's go over the basics of story structure. I tend to think of the basics of story structure as coming in 7 steps, which are as follows. 1. Your hero must choose to go on their adventure, not be thrust into it against their will. If they're thrust into it against their will, how do we know what the hero wants? When Thor gets to Earth, he gets captured and eats a lot, but what's his plan for getting home? I love this movie, but what's his plan for getting home? 2nd, the plan step. This is where a hero enacts their plan to get what they want. 3rd, the midpoint, where according to Mr. Snyder, Blake Snyder, not the other one, the midpoint is usually an emotional low. It can, however, be a false high. Think Mean Girls. Katie has everything she wants, but we can see she's not really happy and she's hurting people. 4th is drive. This is where the hero plays into their character flaws more and more, trying to achieve their goal. This is where Thor would fall back into his old habits of being self-centered and angry, which in this movie he doesn't really do, which is a huge missed opportunity, to be honest. But to be fair, it's also not something that happens in any other movie he's in, so 5th is failure. For people who haven't studied storytelling, this is probably the most recognizable story beat. This is where the hero has failed and they stand in the rain crying about how they failed because they're a failure that failed. The 6th step is resolve, when the hero decides to get back up, change themselves for the better, and face the bad guy. The 7th and final step is the finale, when our hero must make a moral choice and solidify their change. Note, the moral choice doesn't always have to be a positive one. Sometimes your hero can screw up and you can have a bad ending. In fact, casual story consumers? Jeez. Oh my god. Casual story consumers? Most people, most human beings. I tend to find that most people tend to like bad endings because they feel that it is a break from the mold, whereas when you are a story nerd, you really like the mold. The mold is fun. At first glance, it may seem like Thor adheres to these requirements, but with a more detailed understanding of these basic story beats, the movie's structural failings become more clear. At the beginning, Thor lacks any drive or motivation. When he gets to Earth, he makes no choice that sends him on a journey of some kind. The only choice he makes early on is to attack Jotunheim, but attacking Jotunheim does not function as him working towards his goal because his goal hasn't been established by the movie yet, his goal being getting Mjolnir. This probably could have been easily fixed by moving the halfway point where Thor tries to pull Mjolnir up to the beginning. Then finding out that he can't lift Mjolnir is what prompts his character change. The midpoint would then have to be something else, but as a professional writer, when I'm faced with the dilemma of there aren't enough events, my advice is to escalate rather than go back and add. So the midpoint would be Loki's attack, probably. Thor would still not be worthy, and that realization would send him into step 4, drive, when he falls back into his old habits of anger and selfishness. One of the problems with the movie is that Thor's change is pretty much binary at the end. The moment he's away from Asgard, he seemingly settles into a kinda more subdued nature without much issue. So, while there's plenty to go on for scenes, not a lot of them progress the story in meaningful ways, which is pretty frustrating because I tend to think that all the characters in this movie are genuinely well written and pretty fascinating. Thor 1 characterizes Thor in a way that is distinct from other Marvel leads. It's easy to default to he's arrogant as a character trait because we see it as a male character flaw so often. But in this movie, Thor isn't simply full of himself, he's a young man in a position of power. That power informs his personality. We see him be jovial, arrogant, loving, excitable, quick to anger, and quick to prove himself. We even see these qualities reflected in his father, which is a nice touch. His flaw is that he thinks the world revolves around him because it kind of did. In the first movie, Thor doesn't make jokes, he is the joke. It's one of the reasons he's endearing to the audience, why we come to like him, not to mention that his earnestness is a great contrast to the constantly lying Loki. Which brings me to...
Loki, 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 baby, this is part 5, maybe.
To begin this section of the essay, I got a little carried away, and I basically made a fan cam of Loki for funsies. I've set it to some music, and I'd like you to enjoy. Thank you.
Because I'm the monster parents tell their children about at night?
Okay, now that we've done that, Loki is fantastic in this movie, and I'm mad. He has a lot of good moments in this movie, but my favorite part is right here, because at the core of Loki in this movie is his relationship with his father.
Why? You were knee-deep in Jotun blood. Why would you take me?
You were an innocent child.
No. You took me for a purpose. What was it? Tell me!
Even his TV show did not expand on this. It's so clear by the way it's played that Odin loves his son very much, that he truly does think of him as his son. But all Loki knows here is that both his parents lied to him, and his parentage might be why he's not getting the throne. And worst of all, he grew up thinking frost giants were monsters, and he's just found out he's one of them. This dude just found out he is a literal monster, or at least in his mind he is. But we never see Loki grapple with the idea that he killed his biological father, or that there's a whole culture he belongs to that he never got a chance to interact with, or even that his biological father straight up abandoned him for being kind of small. Thor 1 sets up an interesting character who has to grapple with his sense of identity, but nobody ever picks up the torch. Not even his own TV show bothers to pick up the torch. This is a subject that I think a lot of kids who have grown up in cultures that didn't accept them or have moved around a lot would love to see and would relate to. Just think about it, Disney. Just think about bringing it up again, maybe, sometime. I mean, it's been 10 years, but who knows? They might change their minds. Give it another 10 years. We might get there. We might get there.
Whoa, wacky, we're doing the next one.
Rainbow
Whoa,
Road!
no, stop it! Stop it! Take Anthony seriously. We're redoing this one. Okay, you don't have to shout at me.
Sir Anthony, give him the respect he deserves.
Much better.
Why is there a part in this video dedicated to Sir Anthony, you ask? Because I have never seen a man act so hard in a children's comic book movie in my entire life, and I respect it.
My heir.
You are a vain, greedy, cruel boy!
Why'd you twist my
You could
words?
have told me what I was from the beginning. Why didn't you?
You're my son. You have betrayed the express command of your king.
You know, it all makes sense now why you favored Thor all these years. Because no matter how much you claim...
In all seriousness, though, Anthony Hopkins lends a lot of weight and legitimacy to the fake made-up space magic city, and this movie in general. Just the way he plays Odin as loving and kind, but connecting with both his son's biggest failings, being quick to anger and sneaky. There's so much fatherly love in his performance. It pains me to see him in Dark World and Ragnarok. He never reaches that level of believability as a god and a man ever again. In Dark World, he is just kind of horrible to his kids.
She does not belong here in Asgard any more than a goat belongs at a banquet table.
And in Ragnarok, he dies! But the thing is, it's not just Anthony. I prefer everyone's performance in this movie. I feel like Anthony being here is pushing Hiddleston and Hemsworth to be the best that they can be. Hiddleston shines in the truly emotional scenes, and Hemsworth proves he can not only do pitch-perfect comedy, but he can be really heartbroken too, when he's given the chance anyway. Sadly, it doesn't feel like most directors trust Hemsworth to actually deliver the emotional goods. I've never seen any other directors get this out of him again. I think it's your job as a director to push your actors, which Kenneth Branagh does spectacularly here, which brings me to...
We're on part 7. There are a lot of parts to this, but don't worry. We're getting to the end soon. It's only a couple more parts to go. Too loud.
Remember that part where I talked about this movie having Dutch angles akimbo? Well, yeah. That's because Kenneth Branagh, wanted the frames to look like comic book panels. While a cool idea, I do think it's not immediately obvious that's what they're trying to evoke. But now that I know that, I can see it, and it's great. And it really does make it feel more like a comic book to me. Sadly, when I first watched this movie, or rather, the first 50 times I watched this movie, I didn't get that. And I just wondered endlessly, why are there so many Dutch angles in this movie?
Anyway, now I know. Meanwhile...
Marvel seems hell-bent on every movie having a romantic subplot. Regardless, I've long thought Jane and Thor was the most believable forced romantic subplot, but wasn't really able to figure out why. Then, while watching the director's commentary, I stumbled onto this. Essentially, Kenny B, Mr. Branagh, Ken, K-Dog, said that within 2 hours he couldn't build a grand romance, so instead he opted to make it more of an initial attraction. It's not as simple as chemistry. Lots of actors have chemistry, but this relationship, I get it. It's simple, or at least it is for now. It has the potential to build and change. It doesn't try to be anything more than it is, and for that reason, I believe it, and I'm invested in it. As a romantic subplot, it's joyful and fun. You have fun with them as they genuinely get along. There's no forced banter to imply sexual tension, which I know can be fun sometimes, but honestly, it's so overused. If you don't know how to explain in a visual medium that these people find each other attractive without tired heterofatalist tropes, here's how. They earnestly like each other. They earnestly find each other attractive, and it's fun. Take note, other movies. I'm looking at you, Jurassic World. I will find you, Colin! It's not just that, it's really simple stuff that Kenny B does, like the blocking in certain scenes. I don't know if Sir Anthony is on a box in this scene or if it's just sensible camera work, but regardless, we're going out of our way to make Anthony Hopkins, who's 5'9", look huge next to Hiddleston and Hemsworth, who are both several inches over 6 feet. Note, I like that Thor and Loki are on opposite sides, separated by Odin. It's very simple blocking, but for mythology, it seems perfect. The same goes for this scene at the end. We go out of our way to make sure Odin remains the most physically large figure because he's Odin, damn it! And sure, you could say, well, do you need to do that? Why can't the actor just make it feel like he's the most important man in the room? To which I would say, you can, or at least Sir Anthony can, but why not help him out? Why not use visual language to reinforce what your actors are already doing? Part of this is the costuming, giving Sir Anthony the perfect proportions to aid him in looking like the most important man in the room. Which brings us to the costumes.
The costume design. I'm gonna be honest, I don't really know what to do for this one.
Smooth, jazzy,
It's so
good.
It's so good. And it's never this good again in any other Thor movie. Yeah, that's good.
The costume designer, Alexandra Byrne, is skilled not just in construction, but so much more. Costume design is so much more. It's a job for someone who thinks about the visual implications of clothes and the effect that someone's clothes can have on us and our expectations for that character. Which is why in the first movie, we get all these costumes that are designed to make Anthony Hopkins look broad-shouldered and strong.
Now we see him in Dark World, and that silhouette is much less apparent. Partly, I think this is also due to the blocking. In the first movie, we have a lot of shots of Odin distant from everyone else. In Dark World, he seems to just be on a box. There's less clever camera work involved.
My favourite thing that Alexandra Byrne worked on, though, is Thor's cape. The cape is a huge deal. It looks like they pulled it right out of the pages of the comics. I have no idea how they did it, but it's perfect. Alexandra Byrne had this to say about its creation. Every time we said cape, someone would say, that'll be done in post-production. You won't be able to make it work. But our cape does work. The cape needed to look both completely believable and sublimely magical. In the comic books, Kirby used it as a great graphic device for movement, tension, and drama, so our cape needed that amount of expression. We had a graveyard of capes that didn't work, but we kept moving on, trying new fabrics and different ways of cutting, bonding, and weighting. We finally got it to a stage where we pronounced, the cape is working, don't touch it, just leave it alone. The absolute commitment to making the original Silver Age costume plausible in live action is amazing. I want a costume designer to take those wacky Silver Age drawings and make them work. Hashtag get Calizundies back. I mean, look at the helmet. Just look at it. They just made those goofy helmets. They did it. They made them actually work. It looks so much like the comics. But it looks good. This is craftsmanship.
Meanwhile, this is what Thor's cape looks like in Dark World.
Absolutely no forgiveness can be given to Thor's new cape. Why is it so limp? Why didn't they just get the old cape out of storage?
To be completely clear, I don't think any of the costuming work or even the set work in Dark World is objectively bad.
My issue with it is that so much of the costuming ignores what made Asgardian clothing unique in the first place. The nod to Jack Kirby is gone, the dichotomy of technology and mythology, the classic romance and the aesthetic. In Thor 2, we have none of that. I can respect basic paint-by-numbers fantasy, in fact, I love it, but that's not what Thor was. It's so far from what he was in the first movie. Everyone now is just wearing armor, classic fantasy movie armor, and Sif's shield got even smaller. What is this, a shield for ants? Everybody laughs. The very simple problem with these costumes is that they strike me as low magic fantasy. In the fantasy genre, there are lots of qualifiers for the kind of fantasy, such as high fantasy, low magic, and high magic. The difference between high fantasy and fantasy is usually world building. High fantasy is Tolkien, Game of Thrones, but fantasy is more like Carnival Row, Penny Dreadful, most YA novels. They're usually more contained stories. However, low and high magic is determined by the amount of magic present in the world. High magic is usually reserved for worlds where elevators are powered by magic, ships, magic, armor, magic, your toilet, magic. So think Final Fantasy 9 or 14. Examples of low magic are things like Game of Thrones, Witcher, Shadow and Bone. Thor seems pretty obviously a high magic world. That's part of the appeal. It's what makes it whimsical. So when the costumes come out looking like they came out of Game of Thrones rather than something more whimsical, there's a definite disconnect for me.
We're done. Congratulations, you made it all the way to the end.
Kind of beat behind this, even though it's kind of inappropriate.
Is it a perfect movie? No. But it is my favorite Thor movie and one of my favorite Marvel movies in general. I do wish that the arena was a bit more solid and that Thor had more agency. Something as simple as moving this scene to the first thing he did when he got to Earth would have been, in my opinion, much better. The parts of Thor 1 that are good are really good, and it's not all things like costumes and sets, though I talk a lot about the costumes and sets. It's the acting, the writing. The movie is genuinely joyful, dramatic, and romantic in the classic sense of the word. It captures my imagination and it inspires me every time I watch it. I'm a professional writer and I've spent most of my career trying to fine-tune my craft, trying to become a better storyteller, to learn how to make my characters human, lovable, hateable, and how to deliver a cohesive moral argument. But one of my biggest failings as a writer is when I worry too much about the structure. When I put a scene in a novel because it should be there and not because I actually want to write it. Looking back at this movie has solidified something that I've long suspected. You can, as a storyteller, create something perfect, robotic, meticulously planned, and with a carefully picked moral argument, but if there's no passion, it means nothing. And if it means nothing to you, it'll mean even less to everybody else. Which, to be clear, is not a get-out-of-jail-free card for writing crap. At the very beginning of John Truby's The Anatomy of Story, he says this: write something that may change your life. Passion is no substitute for learning how to do your job, but it sure does help. And there is so much passion, hard work, and respect that went into this movie. I can't help but love it. And you should too. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had fun, and goodbye.